Right now I'm working on some round nesting tables and I've already got the tops cut out. That was easily done by gluing up my boards and going after it with my router and circle cutting jig. But the tricky part is going to be the bases. Each table is going to have 2 rings that will be attached with vertical boards. It'll make sense when you see it at the end, but the tricky part is going to be making these rings. And I figure I'd go about it the same way a wood turner might go about doing a segmented bowl or vase. Now I know there's probably a quick mathematical way to calculate what size I need my parts to be, and I'm sure those of you that do a lot of segmented turning probably think that I'm pretty lame, but I'm more of a visual learner, so I'm going to go ahead and figure it out by jumping over to SketchUp. I know that my largest ring is going to have an outside diameter of 36 inches, so I start by making a circle that size. As you can see in SketchUp, a circle isn't really perfectly smooth around, it's already kind of segmented, so I can easily divide up the circle into slices. Once I do that, I see that I'll need to make 8 segments. I could do more segments, but they'd be a lot smaller and there'd be a lot more joints to glue up, so I just kept it at 8. Next, I draw what's going to represent a piece of wood and I place that on my circle. After that, I make lines that follow my slices, and then I delete the excess off the end. And of course I do the same to the other side. Now that I've got that piece drawn, I can copy and paste another one and rotate it into place. And I do that a couple more times, and when I have 4 pieces, I group those together and then copy and paste a new group of 4 and rotate it into place, giving me an 8-piece segmented circle. Now I can grab the protractor tool up here so I can measure the angle down here, and that measurement is 67.5 degrees. So if I subtract that from a 90-degree right angle, it gives me 22.5 degrees, which is what I'll need to set my miter gauge to later when I make the cuts on the table saw. I also measure the longest dimension of one of the segments so I know how long to cut my initial pieces. Again, I'm sure there's an easier way to do this, and if you could tell me about it in the comments, I would appreciate it. Now that I have all my dimensions figured out, the first thing I do is cut the rough lumber down to more manageable sizes. That red oak is surprisingly heavy and it's got some weight to it, so working with smaller pieces makes it a lot easier to move around the shop. The rough lumber was about 8 inches wide, so I also ripped it down to a narrower size that would fit across my joiner easier. After joining all the boards, I pulled out the absolute loudest machine in my shop and I can get the boards down to their final thickness of 1 inch. If you've got a planer, you know how quickly it fills up your dustbin. I used to use my little shop vac hooked up to the planer, and I was using the little 2.5-inch hose that it came with, and it seemed like I was emptying that thing every couple minutes. But then when I got my jet dust collector, I was like, and it was such a huge improvement. I'll put a link in the description to my jet dust collector video that I did a while back, and you can give it a look when you have a minute. And if you're looking to add a dust collector to your shop, the jet model is a great option. Back at the table saw, I ripped down my pieces to their final width of 3 inches so they're ready for the angled cuts. And then to make those angled cuts, I used my Incra miter gauge. This thing has a ton of stops at various degrees, and since the angle I need is 22.5 degrees, it's easy to lock that in. And then I go ahead and make the first cut on all of the pieces. Since I know the length I need, I made a mark and I struck myself a line. Then I took the workpiece back to the miter gauge so I could bring one of the blade teeth right up to my line, clamp a stop block in place, and then finish out my cuts. I want to make sure all my pieces line up and I don't have any gaps, so I lay them out on my table. If there were any gaps, I need to do a little fine tuning, but thankfully everything looked good. Now I finally get to use my Bessey strap clamps again. I don't use these all that often, but every once in a while they come in super handy, like on this project. And I'm really glad I picked up an extra pack of the little clips. The clamp comes with 4, but since I've got 8 joints, having the extra clips is really helpful. And at this point, I'm just clamping everything together to keep the pieces from moving around. With the segmented pieces temporarily strap clamped, I used the tabletop I'd already made to trace the circle shape, making sure to center it as evenly as I can. When I removed the round top, I used that line as a reference so I can make another mark 1 inch in from the line which will be the inner circle I'll cut out later. I also labeled the parts alphabetically so that later I could put them back in the order they're in right now. After I unclamp everything, I draw a line between the two marks, which will be my reference line when I cut out the mortises for the domino joinery. I used the tightest setting on the domino since in the end this circle is only going to be 1 inch wide and I didn't want to risk having any dominoes be exposed along the edges after I cut out the circles with the router, which might have happened if I had any misalignment if I had used the medium domino setting. Even though this is a pretty simple glue up, I still want to move kind of quickly, and to take a little bit of the stress out of the equation, I'm using Titebond 3 wood glue because it gives me a little bit more open time to get everything in place before I clamp it together. If anybody's wondering, I'm using the small 4mm dominoes for this, and again, since I used the tightest setting earlier, the fit is nice and snug and the alignment is spot on. Now that all the joints are glued up, I bring back the strap clamp to keep everything nice and tight, and as long as everything is all good, I'll leave it overnight and I'll come back to it in the morning. The next morning started out with unclamping the strap clamp, leaving me with my segmented ring. Now, referencing my outer circle line that I drew earlier, I take the ring over to the bandsaw to cut away the excess material, which will make it easier to trim with the router in the next step. With the outer excess removed, now I align the tabletop with the pencil line, and I use a few clamps to keep it from moving around. I'm using one of my Mega Flush Trim bits from Infinity Tools to remove the last bit of excess material as the bearing rides along the edge of the tabletop. I'm using the Bosch 1617 plunge router for this, and I'm throwing sawdust everywhere. So I rigged up this super ghetto dust catcher, which was kind of effective, but it wasn't until I was almost finished that I realized I actually have the dust port adapter for this router. So I ended up mounting that to the base plate, and it made a world of difference. It attaches really easily and it doesn't get in the way of your workpiece. So now I'm really looking forward to the next time I have to flush trim something just so that I can use this dust port adapter. I'm flush trimming in sections because I want to make sure the workpiece is super secure to the round tabletop. I don't want this thing to get misaligned at all, and that's why I'm using so many clamps. With a clean outer circle, I draw a new line 1 inch in from the edge, and this line will be the inside edge of the ring. Once again, I bring out my router with the circle cutting jig attached, and since my workpiece is 1 inch thick, I made a 1 inch riser block out of scrap wood, and that has a short piece of 1/8 inch steel rod, and that'll be my new pivot pin. Next, I loosen the lock knob and adjust the distance so that my 1/4 inch spiral bit cuts along my new line. I lock it down and start cutting, and again, going in sections because of all the clamps. Before I started cutting, I set the depth stop on the router to 1 inch, that way I don't over plunge when it comes to the last pass. And finally I get to the last pass and we've got ourselves a successful segmented ring. And since I was careful with my measurements, I ended up with nice smooth edges with no accidental domino blowouts. I repeated these steps for each of the 4 rings I needed for this project, and I'm super happy with how they turned out. So that's how I made the rings for the nesting table bases. I don't know if it was the right way or the wrong way, but it worked, and I'm really happy with how they came out. And of course, if you guys know of another way to do the same thing, leave a comment below because I would love to check it out and maybe I can try that technique on a future project. But if you like this technique, maybe you can also try it on a project of your own. And even though this video was just about how I made these segmented circles for the nesting table bases, here's a few shots of the finished nesting tables after I assembled them and stained them and put some finish on them. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you're not already a subscriber. I'll have a bunch of links down below to all kinds of stuff, and be sure you check out my other videos, and you can also follow me on Instagram @StuffSethMakes. So until next time guys, I'll see you later.